The ballroom fell silent. The instant a crystal wine glass shattered across the marble floor, the sound ringing out like a gunshot beneath the chandeliers of a Manhattan hotel. Red wine soaked through the elegant white gown of the only black woman in the room, spreading in a dark stain that seemed to swallow the light around her. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Before anyone had even decided whether laughing was appropriate, the kind of nervous, cruel laughter that spreads faster than sympathy ever does. A newly rich social media personality and her arrogant husband smirked from a few feet away, loudly accusing her of sneaking into an event reserved for real billionaires. Security guards near the entrance hesitated, unsure whether to intervene in a dispute between guests who all looked, on the surface, like they belonged in that room. No one stepped forward to defend her, and for a long moment she simply stood there, the wine dripping from the hem of her dress onto polished marble. Then, near the stage, the master of ceremonies received a phone call that made his face turn the color of the tablecloths. He gripped the microphone with a hand that had begun to shake, and the room quieted just enough for his voice to carry over the low murmur of confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cracking on the second word, "the woman standing in the wine is the sole owner of the company, about to decide tonight's $842 million acquisition." Every smile in the ballroom disappeared at once, replaced by the particular stillness of people realizing they had made a mistake they could not undo. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence, and somewhere near the back, a single fork clattered against a plate, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden hush. The deal that had brought 217 guests into that room had just become something far more personal than anyone in the crowd had bargained for, and the woman in the ruined white gown had not yet said a single word in her own defense. Her name was Amara Brooks, and at 39 years old she had built one of the most quietly powerful private investment funds in the country, with a personal fortune that had crossed $5 billion 2 years earlier without a single magazine cover to announce it. She disliked spectacle in every form that mattered, and she had structured her entire public life around the idea that true influence rarely needed to raise its voice. She arrived at events alone, without an entourage trailing behind her, without a driver hovering by the door, without the practiced smile so many executives wore like armor against a room full of strangers. That evening she had chosen a simple, elegant white dress, unadorned by the kind of jewelry that announced wealth before a person had said a word, and she carried only a small clutch that held nothing more than a phone and a single credit card. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her makeup understated, her posture the relaxed, unhurried posture of someone who had long ago stopped needing a room's approval. To the 217 people gathered in that ballroom, she was simply a calm woman, standing near the edge of the room, sipping water instead of champagne, watching the crowd with the patient attention of someone who had learned long ago that the loudest people in a room are rarely the most dangerous ones. No one in that crowd knew she was the person who would decide, before midnight, whether an $842 million acquisition would move forward or collapse entirely. She had built her fund from nothing over the course of 15 years, starting with a modest inheritance and a reputation for reading risk more clearly than almost anyone in her field. Colleagues who had worked with her described a woman who asked more questions than she answered, who preferred silence to small talk, and who had never once raised her voice in a negotiation that she eventually won. Tonight, she had come only to observe the final stages of a deal her fund had spent 8 months quietly evaluating, expecting nothing more dramatic than polite conversation and an early exit. She had not expected to become the center of the evening's entertainment for a couple she had never met before that night. She had learned early in her career that visibility and power were not the same thing, and that the people who confused the two rarely lasted long in rooms where real decisions were made. Her mentor, a retired fund manager who had taken a chance on her when she was 24 and unknown, had told her once that the quietest person in any negotiation usually held the most leverage, and she had carried that lesson with her ever since. She had walked away from deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars simply because the people on the other side of the table treated support staff poorly during the meeting, believing that character revealed itself in exactly those unguarded moments. Tonight would prove to be no exception to that private rule. though she could not have predicted just how directly the lesson would apply to her own evening. Across the room, drawing far more attention than she ever sought for herself, stood a couple who had spent the last 18 months becoming impossible to ignore in exactly the circles Amara preferred to move through unnoticed. Victoria Hale had built a cosmetics brand from nothing and sold it for a sum large enough to change her family's life overnight, and she had not stopped reminding people of that fact since the ink dried on the sale. She wore diamonds the size of her own confidence and spoke in a voice pitched slightly louder than necessary, as though volume itself were proof of belonging in rooms she still privately feared she did not belong in. Every gesture she made that evening seemed designed for an audience, from the way she angled her body toward every photographer in the room, to the way she repeated the size of her recent deal to anyone who would listen for more than a minute. Beside her stood her husband, Jason Hale, a real estate investor who had ridden his wife's sudden fortune into rooms he had never been invited to before, and who had developed, in a remarkably short time, a talent for looking down on people he did not understand. He had grown up with considerably less than the life he now performed for strangers, and something about that history seemed to sharpen his need to prove, loudly and often, that he had left it behind for good. Together they moved through the crowd, correcting waiters, name-dropping acquaintances they barely knew, and scanning every unfamiliar face for a reason to dismiss it before it could question them first. Together they had become the kind of newly wealthy couple that hotel ballrooms both courted and quietly dreaded, generous with their money and even more generous with their contempt for anyone who failed to perform wealth the way they had learned to. They had spent the better part of the evening trying to prove they belonged among the real power in that room, correcting waiters over minor details, name-dropping acquaintances at every opportunity, and scanning every unfamiliar face for a reason to dismiss it. The hotel itself had been chosen for exactly this kind of occasion, a 6-star property with marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and staff trained never to let their expressions slip no matter what unfolded in front of them. 217 guests filled the room that autumn evening, a mixture of chief executives, fund managers, attorneys, and a handful of journalists invited to document what everyone assumed would be a triumphant signing. Outside, a light rain fell over the city, blurring the headlights along the avenue and pressing a hush against the tall windows that overlooked the wet street below. Not one person in that crowd knew who held the final authority over the deal they had all gathered to celebrate. And that single piece of missing information was about to matter more than anything else in the room that night. Waitstaff moved between the tables carrying trays of champagne and small, carefully arranged appetizers, trained to anticipate a guest's needs before the guest had even noticed them. A string quartet played quietly near one corner of the room, providing a soundtrack meant to suggest wealth without ever overpowering conversation. Photographers hired for the evening drifted along the edges of the crowd, capturing the kind of images destined for glossy financial publications the following week, images of handshakes and toasts, rather than the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Several of the 217 guests had flown in from other cities specifically for this signing, treating the evening as much as a networking opportunity as a formal transaction. Somewhere near the entrance, a coat check attendant quietly noted that the woman in the simple white dress had arrived without a driver, a small detail that meant nothing to her at the time, but that she would later recall with considerable interest. The room hummed with the particular energy of people who believed, correctly or not, that they belonged among the most important names in the industry. Victoria noticed Amara early in the evening, the way people who measure worth by appearance often notice the one person who refuses to perform for them. She took in the simple dress, the absence of a bodyguard, the lack of a driver waiting curbside, and she drew her conclusions instantly and without a moment of hesitation. In her mind, real power always announced itself, and a woman standing quietly near the edge of the room with no entourage could not possibly belong among the decision-makers gathered there that night. She crossed the floor with her husband, trailing a step behind her, moving with the deliberate confidence of a woman used to getting a reaction wherever she went. When she reached Amara, she asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, whether she was here with the catering staff, the question landing with a casual cruelty that suggested she had asked similar questions before. A waiter passing nearby slowed his steps just slightly, close enough to hear the exchange without appearing to listen. Amara only smiled, the kind of smile that revealed nothing and demanded nothing in return, and said that she was simply enjoying the evening. Jason picked up where his wife had left off, tilting his head toward the main entrance, and remarking that guests of real importance did not usually come through that particular door. A few nearby conversations paused as people registered the tone of the exchange. Though none of them intervened on Amara's behalf, each guest silently grateful the attention had landed on someone else. Discomfort moved through that small cluster of guests the way it often does in rooms full of powerful people, present but unspoken, everyone waiting for someone else to name what was happening out loud. Amara's expression did not change, and she took a slow sip of water before answering, her calm somehow more unsettling to Victoria than any argument could have been. She had spent enough years in rooms exactly like this one to recognize the particular cruelty of people who had recently acquired money and had not yet learned what to do with the insecurity that came bundled inside it. Victoria's smile faltered slightly at the lack of a reaction, though she quickly covered it with a short, dismissive laugh directed at her husband. Victoria, sensing that her first attempts had not produced the reaction she wanted, decided the evening called for something more theatrical to satisfy the small audience that had begun to gather. She positioned herself directly in Amara's path as the room began moving toward the stage where the signing ceremony would soon take place, blocking her with the casual confidence of someone who believed she had every right to do so. She demanded, loudly enough now that heads began to turn from several tables away, to see Amara's invitation, insisting that the event organizers took security seriously and that anyone without proper credentials needed to be checked immediately. A guest near the bar lifted a phone and began recording, sensing that something worth remembering was unfolding in front of them in real time. Amara reached into her small clutch, produced nothing more than a calm expression, and said she was certain the organizers already knew exactly who she was, her tone flat and entirely unbothered. She did not raise her voice, did not attempt to argue her way past Victoria, and did not appeal to the growing audience for support or sympathy. That composure, more than anything else, seemed to enrage Victoria further, as though the absence of a fight had somehow robbed her of the victory she had already decided was hers. A nearby attorney, someone who had worked with Amara's fund on prior deals but had not immediately recognized her without the usual formality of a boardroom, watched the exchange with visible discomfort, but said nothing, assuming it was not his place to intervene in what looked like a private disagreement between two guests. Another woman standing close enough to hear the whole exchange later admitted she had considered speaking up, but talked herself out of it in the span of a few seconds, telling herself it was simply not her business to get involved. That particular kind of silence, the collective decision of an entire room to look away, rather than risk their own comfort, would later become one of the most discussed details of the entire evening. Victoria seemed to feed off that silence, mistaking it for agreement rather than discomfort, and she straightened her shoulders as though she had just won an argument no one had actually been having with her. Jason, encouraged by his wife's momentum, added a remark of his own about the importance of maintaining standards at events like this one, drawing a few uneasy chuckles from guests who clearly wanted the moment to end more than they wanted to agree with him. Amara glanced briefly toward the entrance, where a small security detail stood watching the exchange without moving, and something in her expression suggested she had already decided how the rest of the evening would unfold, regardless of what happened in the next few minutes. The refusal to fight back seemed to strip Victoria of the confrontation she had been hoping for, and something in her expression shifted from irritation into something closer to desperation for control over the moment. She glanced at the small crowd that had gathered, aware now that eyes were on her from multiple directions, and decided the moment required an ending dramatic enough to match the attention it had already drawn. A young couple near the edge of the circle exchanged an uneasy glance, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to be the ones to speak up first. Jason leaned in close to his wife and murmured something too quiet for anyone else to hear, though the smirk that followed suggested he had encouraged whatever she was about to do next. Victoria reached for a glass of red wine from a passing tray, her fingers closing around the stem with a steadiness that betrayed exactly how deliberate her next move would be. She tilted her body forward, as though stumbling, timing the motion with theatrical precision, and let the wine spill directly across the front of Amara's white dress. The sound of shattering glass followed almost immediately, sharp and final, the exact sound that had opened this entire story before rewinding back to the moment that caused it. 217 guests turned toward the sound of the shattering glass, and in the silence that followed, laughter broke out from several corners of the room before anyone had fully processed what had actually happened. Jason clapped. Actually clapped. As though his wife had just delivered a punchline rather than orchestrated a public humiliation in front of an entire ballroom of witnesses. The sound of his applause seemed to give the surrounding crowd permission to keep laughing, and within seconds the ripple of cruel amusement had spread to tables that hadn't even seen the incident directly. Amara looked down at the crimson stain spreading across white fabric, feeling the cool wetness against her skin, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her reaction. Victoria looked at the ruined dress and said, loud enough for the cameras still recording to catch every word, that at least now the woman had a reason to leave the party early. Security finally began moving through the crowd, though their hesitation suggested they were still uncertain whose side authority actually favored in a moment this publicly humiliating. The air in the ballroom thickened with the particular tension that follows public cruelty. A mixture of secondhand embarrassment and quiet relief among those grateful the humiliation hadn't landed on them instead. A few guests reached for their phones, uncertain whether to record or simply look away, torn between curiosity and the vague sense that they were witnessing something that would matter later. One older gentleman near the bar, a longtime fixture of the city's financial circles, shook his head slowly and turned back to his drink, muttering something under his breath about the manners of new money. A young associate from one of the law firms present quietly stepped back from the group, later admitting she had felt an instinctive need to distance herself from a moment she suspected would not reflect well on anyone standing too close to it. The music from the string quartet faltered slightly, the musicians clearly aware that something in the room had shifted, though they continued playing out of professional habit rather than obliviousness. Amara remained at the center of it all, the wine still dripping steadily from the hem of her dress onto the polished floor beneath her feet. Amara stood perfectly still as the wine soaked into the fabric, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply looking down at the stain, the way a person might study a puzzle rather than a wound. She did not raise her voice, did not demand an apology, and did not allow her face to betray the humiliation that any reasonable person would have felt standing exactly where she stood. Instead, she reached for a cloth napkin from a nearby table and began dabbing gently at the stain, her movements unhurried and precise, as though the ruined dress were a minor inconvenience rather than a public spectacle. Several guests nearby shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to offer help or continue pretending they hadn't witnessed what had just happened in front of them. When she finally spoke, her words were quiet enough that only those closest to her could hear them clearly, carrying none of the anger the moment seemed to call for. "I will remember this," she told Victoria, and then she turned away, leaving the couple standing in the sudden awkwardness of a joke that had not landed the way they expected it to. Near the stage, the master of ceremonies felt his phone vibrate in his jacket pocket, and when he answered it, the color drained from his face within seconds of hearing the voice on the other end. Event organizers began moving briskly toward the back of the room, their earlier composure replaced by a barely concealed panic that spread from one staff member to the next like a current through still water. A pair of attorneys who had been quietly reviewing paperwork near the stage suddenly abandoned their documents and hurried toward the hotel's private offices, phones pressed against their ears as they walked. The hotel's general manager, a man rarely seen outside his own office during events of this size, appeared at the edge of the ballroom, looking as though he had run the entire way from wherever he had been standing. Staff members whispered urgently among themselves, repeating the same question in hushed, anxious tones, asking where Miss Brooks could be found and whether anyone had seen which direction she had gone after the incident. A junior event coordinator nearly dropped her tablet when someone finally pointed toward the corner where Amara stood quietly wiping wine from her dress with a borrowed napkin. Guests nearby began to notice the sudden shift in energy among the people meant to be running the evening smoothly, and confusion started to replace the earlier laughter that had filled the room only minutes before. Something had clearly changed in the last several minutes, though almost no one in that crowd yet understood exactly what it was or why it mattered so much. The master of ceremonies climbed the small stage steps with visible effort, straightening his jacket as though the gesture might steady his nerves before he reached the microphone waiting for him. He announced, in a voice that cracked slightly on the first word, that the sole owner of the investment fund deciding tonight's acquisition would now be joining them to say a few words to the room. Every head in the ballroom turned at once toward the main entrance, waiting for someone important to walk through it, someone with the entourage and presence Victoria had assumed such a person would surely have. No one entered through that door. Long seconds passed in uncomfortable silence before people began glancing at each other, searching faces for some clue about who they were supposed to be watching for in the crowd. It was Amara who finally moved, walking calmly from the edge of the room where she had been standing all evening, her ruined white dress still marked by the stain. No one had bothered to help her clean. Every eye in the room slowly turned to follow her, disbelief spreading across faces one at a time, as recognition began to dawn. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that the sound of her heels against the marble floor seemed to echo off every wall as she crossed it. Victoria let out a short, nervous laugh, glancing at her husband as though searching for reassurance that this had to be some kind of misunderstanding, some coincidence that would resolve itself in the next few seconds. Jason said nothing, his earlier confidence noticeably absent from his expression as he watched the woman he had mocked minutes earlier walk toward the very stage meant for the evening's most important announcement. A woman near the front table leaned toward her companion and whispered a question neither of them could yet answer. Amara reached the steps without hesitation, climbed them with the same unhurried composure she had carried through every insult thrown at her that night, and turned to face the crowd that had laughed at her humiliation only moments before. The master of ceremonies stepped aside, handing her the microphone with a hand that had not stopped trembling since the phone call that started this entire chain of events. For a moment, she simply looked out over the 217 faces staring back at her, letting the silence stretch just long enough for its weight to be felt by everyone in the room. The master of ceremonies introduced her properly this time, reading from a card with a voice that had regained just enough steadiness to make every word land with its full intended weight. Amara Brooks, he announced, founder, chairwoman, and 100% owner of the investment fund that held the deciding vote on tonight's $842 million acquisition. A collective intake of breath moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass, followed almost immediately by the scraping sound of 217 chairs pushing back as guests rose to their feet out of pure reflex. Jason's face went pale in a way that suggested he finally understood the scale of what his wife had just done in front of witnesses, cameras, and a room full of people whose livelihoods depended on staying on the right side of exactly this kind of power. Victoria's phone slipped from her hand and clattered against the marble floor, the screen cracking in a way that felt almost symbolic, given everything else shattering around her in that moment. Somewhere near the back of the room, a photographer who had spent the evening documenting champagne toasts suddenly found himself capturing something far more significant. A chief executive at one of the front tables, a man known throughout the industry for rarely showing surprise at anything, sat frozen with his glass halfway to his mouth, staring at the stage as though trying to reconcile the calm woman he now recognized with the stories he had heard about her fund for years. Two attorneys near the back exchanged a brief, knowing glance, having worked adjacent to Amara's firm on prior transactions and immediately understanding the scale of what had just unfolded in front of everyone. A junior analyst, seated closer to the stage, quietly pulled up his firm's internal records on his phone beneath the table, confirming within seconds that the fund named on the screen was indeed the very one holding final approval over the deal that had brought them all there that night. No one in that room was laughing anymore, and the silence that replaced the laughter felt heavier than anything that had come before it. The applause that eventually broke the silence carried an edge of nervous disbelief, the sound of people trying to recover their footing after realizing how badly they had misjudged the room and everyone in it. Victoria stepped forward first, her voice unsteady as she attempted an apology, insisting the entire incident had simply been a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand somehow. Jason followed with his own version of the same excuse, claiming the wine spill had been a genuine accident and that his laughter had only been nervous energy rather than cruelty toward a stranger. Amara listened to both of them without interrupting, her expression calm in a way that made their explanations sound thinner with every additional word they added. A few guests nearby exchanged glances, clearly unconvinced by the sudden shift in tone from the couple who had been so confident only minutes earlier. Victoria's voice grew increasingly desperate as she spoke, shifting from apology to justification and back again within the span of a single sentence, as though she could not decide which version of events might still save her. Jason attempted to place a hand on his wife's shoulder, a gesture that seemed intended to project unity, but instead only drew more attention to how visibly rattled they both had become in front of the crowd. When they finished, she asked a staff member standing near the stage to bring up the hotel's security footage from earlier that evening, footage that had already been quietly reviewed by her legal team the moment the first phone call went out. The footage played across a screen at the side of the stage, showing with unmistakable clarity the deliberate tilt of Victoria's arm and the calculated angle of the glass as it emptied across white fabric below her. The room watched in silence as the recording confirmed what many guests had already suspected but had been too polite or too intimidated to say aloud earlier in the evening. Jason's laughter appeared clearly in the footage as well, timed precisely to the moment the wine made contact with Amara's dress, leaving no room for the excuse of nervous reaction that he had offered moments before. Victoria's face, still visible on the large screen, showed no trace of an accidental stumble, only the satisfied smirk of someone who believed she was untouchable in a room full of strangers. Whispers moved through the crowd as guests turned to look at each other, then back at the couple standing frozen near the stage, their earlier confidence completely stripped away in front of everyone. A few guests near the front actually turned their chairs slightly, no longer willing to sit shoulder to shoulder with the couple they had laughed alongside only minutes before. Amara handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies without raising her voice or delivering the kind of speech the moment seemed to demand from her. The silence that followed said everything that needed saying, and it settled over the ballroom like a verdict already rendered by everyone present. Amara turned to her legal team, who had assembled quietly near the edge of the stage the moment the footage finished playing on the large screen behind her. She ordered an immediate halt to all negotiations connected to Jason Hale's real estate holdings, effective before anyone in that room had a chance to leave their seats or process what they had just witnessed. She instructed her attorneys to remove his company entirely from the list of approved partners for the acquisition, a decision that would ripple through boardrooms long before the sun rose over the city that morning. Every subsidiary contract tied to his firm was to be terminated within the week, she said, and the $842 million deal would instead move forward with a competing company whose leadership had spent the evening behaving like professionals rather than performers. Jason attempted to interject, his voice rising with the particular panic of a man watching his fortune evaporate in real time in front of an audience of industry peers. Amara had already turned away from him before he finished his sentence, her attention shifting to the paperwork one of her attorneys had already begun preparing. The decision had been made, and it had been made with the same composure she had carried through every insult thrown at her earlier that night. Within days, the consequences of that single evening began unfolding exactly as anyone familiar with markets might have predicted from the very beginning. News outlets that had originally been invited to cover a celebratory signing instead published a very different story, built around video footage that had already begun circulating widely among industry insiders and financial reporters. Shares tied to Jason's real estate holdings dropped sharply as investors reacted to reports that his firm had been publicly dropped from an $842 million acquisition under humiliating and very public circumstances. Victoria's cosmetics endorsement deals, the very foundation of the fortune that had made her feel untouchable, began disappearing one by one as brand partners quietly distanced themselves from the growing controversy surrounding her name. A trade publication ran a lengthy piece analyzing the footage frame by frame, noting the calculated nature of Victoria's movements in language that left little room for sympathy. Reporters who had once competed for interviews with the newly wealthy couple now published stories examining every calculated gesture Victoria had made that night, treating the footage as a case study in public humiliation gone wrong. Business commentators who covered the deal noted that Jason's firm had been quietly struggling with cash flow problems for months, and that the loss of the acquisition removed the one piece of good news his investors had been counting on to offset those concerns. Within 2 weeks, A second, smaller developer who had partnered with Jason on an unrelated project also announced it was reconsidering the arrangement, citing what its statement vaguely described as reputational concerns. Victoria's own team of publicists reportedly resigned as a group rather than continue managing the fallout, a detail that leaked to the press almost as quickly as the original video had. A morning television program dedicated an entire segment to the footage, inviting a panel of guests to discuss what the incident revealed about the way newly acquired wealth could distort a person's sense of who deserved respect and who did not. Public reaction to the coverage, though Amara herself paid it little attention, grew quickly as strangers began recounting their own experiences of being underestimated by people who mistook quiet confidence for weakness. A university professor who taught a course on corporate ethics later asked permission to use the footage, with names removed, as a teaching example for a new class of graduate students, believing it illustrated something textbooks rarely captured about power and assumption. Several students in that class would later say the case stayed with them longer than almost anything else covered that semester, precisely because it involved no crime, no scandal in the traditional sense, only the quiet, ordinary cruelty of underestimating a stranger. Even a rival cosmetics brand, sensing an opportunity, ran an advertisement built around themes of humility and respect that many viewers immediately understood as a pointed reference to Victoria's downfall, without ever naming her directly. Industry newsletters that had once profiled Victoria as an example of self-made success now quietly removed her from their archives of featured entrepreneurs, replacing her story with someone else's before the month was out. Reputation, it turned out, could collapse far faster than it had ever been built, and within a matter of weeks, the couple who had once demanded to see an invitation found themselves excluded from rooms they had spent years trying to enter in the first place. 1 month later, Amara attended another industry gathering, this one held in a different hotel across town, though the crowd filling the room looked remarkably similar to the one that had watched her humiliation weeks earlier. This time, when she entered, the entire room rose to greet her, executives and investors alike, acknowledging her presence with the kind of respect that required no introduction and no explanation whatsoever. Waiters who recognized her from news coverage offered small, genuine nods as she passed, a quiet acknowledgement that felt worlds apart from the treatment she had received 1 month prior. A young businesswoman, still early in her own career, approached her during a quiet moment near the bar and asked the question that had clearly been on her mind since news of the incident had spread through the industry. She wanted to know why Amara hadn't reacted immediately that night, why she had allowed the humiliation to unfold in front of 217 witnesses without defending herself in the moment it happened. Amara considered the question for a moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than bitter, as though she had turned the same question over in her own mind more than once since that evening. "Character isn't revealed when people respect you," she finally said, her voice steady and unhurried. "It's revealed when they think they don't have to." The young woman fell quiet, clearly turning the words over in her mind, and around them the room seemed to still slightly as those nearby caught fragments of the exchange between the two women. Applause eventually broke out among the small crowd gathered close enough to hear, a quiet, genuine kind of appreciation rather than the nervous recovery applause that had followed her introduction weeks earlier under very different circumstances. Amara accepted it with the same composure she had carried through every moment of that difficult evening, neither seeking the attention nor shrinking from it in the slightest. She spent the rest of the evening in quiet conversation with colleagues who had known her for years, discussing the $842 million deal now moving smoothly toward its final stages with its new, more respectful partner. No one in that room mentioned Victoria or Jason by name, though everyone present understood exactly which absence the evening's success now represented. The young businesswoman who had asked about that night found herself invited, before the evening ended, to a smaller gathering the following week, where Amara occasionally met with founders early in their careers, an invitation extended not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest in the questions she had asked. It was a small gesture, easy to overlook in a room full of much larger transactions, but it reflected the same principle Amara had lived by, long before that ballroom ever tested it publicly. Power, she had come to believe, was measured less by what a person could take from a room and more by what they chose to give back to the people just beginning to find their way into it. Later that night, as she stepped out of the hotel into the cool autumn air, the city lights of Manhattan stretched out before her in their familiar, indifferent glow, unbothered by anything that had happened beneath them. Rain from weeks earlier had long since cleared, leaving the pavement dry beneath her shoes as she walked toward a waiting car she had, for once, allowed herself to call. On a screen inside a nearby office building, financial news scrolled past confirming that the $842 million acquisition had officially closed, signed instead with a partner whose conduct had proven itself worthy of the deal from the very beginning. Analysts on the broadcast noted, almost in passing, that the fund behind the acquisition had a long-standing reputation for choosing partners based on integrity as much as capital, a detail that suddenly carried far more weight than it once had. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment considerably smaller than the one they had recently sold, Victoria and Jason watched the same broadcast in silence, the $842 million now belonging to someone else's ledger entirely. Neither of them said anything for a long time after the segment ended. Amara, meanwhile, walked the last few blocks to her car instead of riding, preferring the quiet rhythm of her own footsteps on the pavement to the hum of conversation she had left behind inside the hotel. She thought briefly of the mentor who had taught her, years earlier, that leverage rarely needed to raise its voice, and she suspected he would have found the entire evening almost predictable had he lived to see it unfold. She thought, too, of the 217 people who had watched the whole thing happen, some laughing, some silent, and how differently each of them would likely tell the story in the months to come. None of that mattered nearly as much, she decided, as the simple fact that the deal had gone to people who deserved it, and that the couple who had once demanded proof of her worth now understood, far too late, exactly what they had been standing in front of. Respect costs nothing, the closing thought seemed to whisper across the quiet street as she walked. Disrespect can cost everything, and no fortune, however recently acquired, could ever buy its way back. Once that lesson had been learned in front of 217 witnesses who would not soon forget what they had seen.